Hello everyone, I'm J.D. Steele. I'm Vice President here at SkyView Partners, and I'm happy to welcome you today for our session on what's new with V7R2 security, presented by Carol Woodbury. You're going to see a lot of new security enhancements, and I know you'll enjoy this session. Coffee with Carol is sponsored by SkyView Partners. We're happy to provide this free webinar series of education for all of you out there, and I'm just so happy for you to attend. SkyView Partners is a leader in security services and products for IBM I, AIX, and Linux, and it truly is our goal to draw on the unparalleled expertise of our team of experts led by Carol Woodbury to become team members for our clients' IT group, where we pay attention to security details so our clients can spend time on other IT issues. Carol Woodbury is the co-founder, president, and CTO of SkyView Partners. Prior to that, Carol spent 16 plus years at IBM in positions including Chief Engineering Manager and Security Architect for IBM's Enterprise Server Group. Carol is an award-winning speaker and acknowledged leader on security topics, as well as the author of the book IBM I Security Administration and Compliance. SkyView Partners has a number of solutions that can help. Most recently, we've added our managed security service, which our clients are very excited about. And I'll be happy to tell you about a little bit more about this after the session if you'd like to stay. Managed Security Services is a monthly offering where truly SkyView security experts led by Carol will pay attention to your security so that you don't have to. And it is available for IBM I, AIX, and Linux. We continue to do our security checkups for IBM I, AIX, and Linux, as well as remediation services. So if you have projects, please give us a call. As well as our software offerings, a risk assessor diagnostic tool, policy minder security administration tool, audit journal reporter reports, as well as policy minder now for open systems. And keep in mind that all SkyView Partner software is available in an unlimited software license. So with that, I'd like to bring on our presenter and start our session on what's new in V7R2 security. Morning, Carol.
Good morning, JD. Thanks.
There we go.
Okay, let's get started here. So I titled this, What's New in Security, because I'm actually going to start back at V7R1 with a couple items. And there's also one slide on V6 enhancement, and it's because I actually have to build on that for the V7R2 enhancement that came into that. So let's start with V7R1 and the technology releases. So I'll go through these pretty quickly, but I know that there are a number of you who are upgrading from V6R1 up to the V7R2 timeframe and kind of skipping the V7. So I wanted to make sure that you were aware of what was there in V7R1 as well. Okay, so in V7R1 there were two new parameters added to the user profile. Those are the user expiration date and the user expiration interval. So these are at the very, very, very end of the create user profile command. So you have to scroll all the way through those parameters to get to this screen. So what this allows you to do is when you are creating a user profile and you know that you have someone coming in on a temporary, for example, when we're doing remediation services and one of our consultants comes into your shop, you can create a profile for us, and then at the end of the contract date, you can put the date in there, and automatically our profile will be disabled on that date. The other thing that you can do, if you don't want to use a date, you can put the number of days. So perhaps you want to say that it is a 30-day time frame. So you could put that as the user expiration interval rather than put a date down. So either one of those is a lot of flexibility and allows you to start managing those profiles and get them inactivated as soon as they are no longer being used, instead of waiting for your normal process to kick in where the profile is disabled after 60 or 90 days typically. Okay, another thing that came in V7R1 is an enhancement to some of the exit points. So, you know, a lot of people think of the exit points as being the things that control FTP and ODBC. There's actually exit points out of commands. And so there was an enhancement to the command exit point that allows you to have the retrieve exit point get called after the command is run. So, for example, maybe there's something that you need to clean up after a user profile is deleted, for example. So this could run after the delete user profile, or maybe after, that's a bad example because there's an exit out of delete user profile. But regardless, you can get the command exit to run after the command and not just before. Right now, without this enhancement, the exit was only fired before the command was run. Now it can run after as well. So that allows some more flexibility. Also, what came in V7R1, actually through one of the technology releases, was an enhancement to application administration. And I've talked about this before. I've talked about application administration before, and I have a white paper on this topic. If you watch our newsletters come through, I've talked about this functionality. But what you can do with application administration, and the way that you actually get to this screen before you even can manage it, you have to get to this. So the way that you get to this screen is by firing up iNavigator, and you right-click on the system name, and you choose Application Administration. So it will default to come up to this first tab, but if you click on the third tab called Host Applications, you can open this up. And under the IBM I heading, you'll see one for database. So if you open that up, there are two new functions that have been added, the DDM and DRDA, as well as the Toolbox Application Server Access. So for many releases down in the TCP/IP category, there's been controls for FTP. So you can think of this as almost like an exit program, okay? But it's not actually an exit program. It's actually controls that get checked on IBM I for the use of this case in FTP, but the same controls were added now for ODBC access and DDM/DRDA access. So what this allows you to do is say which users are allowed to use this functionality. So it's an on-off switch. Either Carol can use this function or she can't. So there is no granularity saying Carol can download file XYZ, but she can't download anything else. Either I can use the function or I can't. So in a lot of cases, you will be able to use this functionality to shut off this access because the majority of your users don't need this functionality. So in that way, you can just do a swipe and remove that vulnerability from your system. But if you need any kind of granularity to it, like I say, being able to decide which file you can download, you're going to have to use an exit program, a full-blown exit program for that. But this is great function that will help reduce a lot of vulnerability and reduce the risk for having data being downloaded when it shouldn't be downloaded or uploaded for that matter. So that's great functionality that came in. Okay, and I should have said this at the beginning, that this is kind of a hodgepodge of topics here. So each new screen almost brings a new topic. So a lot of these are just kind of random topics. So here's a new topic for you. The CD entry from an audit journal entry type. So the CD entry is the entry that lists out the commands that were run. So if you turn on command auditing for a user, either through the command called change user aud, that's how you would enable it, and specify the *CMD. Whenever somebody types in a command on a command line or runs a CL command in a CL program, one of these CD entries is logged in the audit journal. So the problem with that audit journal entry was that it was really difficult prior to this enhancement to be able to know exactly the CL programs or CL commands that were run from a command line, because there was no distinction between those commands running in batch mode or other types of mode. The only indication was when it was running in a CL program proper. So during one of the technology releases, IBM added some new variables or some new values to the run from CL program field. So it will allow all of us to better filter and get really down to what is being run in an interactive job, meaning from the command line. So it's really close to being able to filter out and just get those interactive commands. So from any of us that have to review or generate those reports, this is a really great enhancement that came in one of those technology releases for V7R1. The other major enhancement in V7R1 was the FIELDPROC support. I'm really not going to go into this very much because we've already had a coffee with Carol on this topic with guest host Patrick Townsend, so I'll let you go back and watch that if you missed that. But FIELDPROC is a way to enable encryption at a field level without having to rework your entire application. So I see a lot of our customers starting to consider using this functionality to encrypt data that they had never thought that they would encrypt before. So this is an incredibly powerful function that this enables. Now just understand that this is not something where you can say, oh, this column is automatically encrypted. It's not that. This functionality enables the encryption, basically an exit that is called whenever a column is written to or read from. So you can attach a program to that exit that will encrypt the data going into or decrypt the data coming out of that column. So again, it's very, very powerful. The vendors are already plugged their functionality into this, the encryption vendors have, and so there's some really great stuff going on using this FIELDPROC functionality. The other thing that came in V7R1 is something called a server authentication entry enhancement. Now, a server authentication entry is what allows you to map a DDM or a DRDA connection from one user to a different user, or preferably to the same user. But there are some cases where you have to make a DDM connection or a DRDA connection from many different clients, and you want to map that basically into one user on the connection. And so you can do that now through having an entry be a group profile instead of having to add a single entry for every individual user. So if you are having to do this functionality, this is a great enhancement. Many people won't care about this one, but for those of you who do, this is a great lifesaver from an administration point of view. Okay, so that was a review of V7R1. So let's get into the V7R2 functionality. A couple new audit values that are now available on the audit level system values. So the audit level system value is the one that controls what actions are audited across the entire system. So the two new ones that came in are PTF object, which is changes to PTF objects during PTF operations, and PTF operations, so such as the load or apply removal of PTFs. Now these two, and especially that last one, I think is fantastic because it allows you to now document for your auditors and have proof right out of the audit journal that you are applying those patches on a regular basis. So you no longer have to keep track of it through any other way but generating an audit journal entry report for your PTF operations. So I think that this is a fantastic value that came in V7R2. So corresponding to the new audit journal values, we have some new audit types. One will support the row and column access controls, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And then the PF and PU for the PTF operations that I've just talked about, and F2, which will log changes to query manager profiles. Now, another enhancement that came in for the auditing is that there were a number of changes to existing audit journal entry types to log the before values. So if you're familiar with the audit journal entry for system value changes, you know that the before value has always been logged for system value changes. So they added similar function for a lot of the other audit journal entry types as well. So things like changes to an auditing value will show the previous auditing value as well as now the current auditing value. So that has been changed for all of these different audit journal entry types. Now they have also added changes to user profiles and previous values for that, but it wasn't all of the previous values. So it's just the previous special authority values that have been added to that audit journal entry type. Also in 7.2, there was just a lot of things that were brought up to date, a lot of technology refreshes, if you will. So things like the cipher algorithms that were used for SSL, the older algorithms have been removed, and you can see those changes on the system value that controls the cipher list. You can see the new ones that have been added, and then if you compare it to a previous system, the ones that were removed. There's a new version of Java that ships with the system. The web servers have been refreshed, including new authentication methods and the updated encryption support, so that's good. We now have a new refresh of PACE, and it is running the current AIX version, which happens to be 7.1, AIX 7.1. The OpenSSL version that is in use within PACE is now the version 1.01G, and rest assured this is not the one that had the heartbleed issue, so rest easy on that one. And there's been updated encryption algorithms that have been put in place for the IBM iVPN support. So a lot of good technology refresh there. There's other enhancements such as the TLS version 1.1 is available and 1.2. TLS is simply the formal protocol for SSL. So the standards refer to it as TLS. So that's what TLS stands for, or that's what TLS is. There's also OCSP support for determining when a digital certificate should be revoked. So when would you ever want that? Well, sometimes the certificate authority certificate has been spoofed or it's been compromised in some way. So you may want to know when those certificates have been revoked or taken out of commission. You don't want to use them anymore, so you now have a method for determining that. DCM, or Digital Certificate Manager, now supports the ability to assign multiple certificates to a server. So previously, if you went into DCM to assign a digital certificate to a server to enable an SSL connection, you only had the ability to assign one certificate at a time. So now you can do multiples, so that's good. And you're going to get a performance boost for the services that are using the AES and the SHA-2 algorithms. So those are things like the crypto services APIs. So if you've done anything to use encryption yourself and roll your own solution using the software encryption APIs, that will get a performance boost. Things like the software tape encryption, system SSL, and VPN connections and so forth will see a performance gain with the Power 8 hardware, not just the 7.2 release, but the Power 8 hardware. That's where that comes in. And again, a different topic, new topic, changes to some commands. So the work object own, work object PGP, and work object private authority commands now allow you to specify, they've added a object type to that command so you can filter down more of what you want to look for. Instead of getting, for example, all the objects that somebody owns, you can filter it and say, I would just want to see objects of type file, for example. There has been a new parameter added to the user profile in V7R2, and it has to do with the max storage. So this is the amount of storage that the owned objects, the objects owned by this particular profile, can take up in storage. So if you have independent ASPs, you may have, like terabytes of data owned by a particular profile. So if you started to specify an actual value for that, the previous max storage parameter was too small. So they've added a max storage large parameter to allow you to specify a larger value for a user to own. No max is still no max, but if you start to specify an actual value, you may need to flip over and use this other parameter instead. Okay, so here is a kind of a back to the future thing. I needed to explain what came in V6R1 before I can explain another new enhancement in V7R2. So in V6R1, there were 3 new password composition, or I should say, system values that apply to passwords. So it was the password change block, and that says how many hours have to go by before an end user can run the change password command again. And that's really to prevent somebody from running the change password command repeatedly so that they get back to their old password. Okay, so that's what that is. Another password system value that came in V6R1 is the password expiration warning. So instead of having the hard-coded default of getting that, hey, your password's about to expire, and having that hard-coded to be 7 days ahead of the expiration interval, you can now customize what that, how many days ahead the users get that warning. But the biggest one that came in V6R1 is one called password rules. So what was happening is that there were more password rules, typically in the network world, that could be applied in the network, but there wasn't a corresponding requirement on IBM I. And so rather than add more and more and more individual system values, they added one called password rules, and now have the ability to add multiple values to that system value. It's kind of like the audit level system value, but that you can specify values for that system value that say what the auditing actions are going to be. Same thing with password rules. Okay, so here are the rules that came in V6R1, or the options that you have in V6R1. And so you can say how many digits. It's not just that you can say it requires a digit. Now you can say how many digits it has to have. You can say whether you won't allow it as the last character or you won't allow it as the first character, and that sort of thing. So it's very, very powerful what you can do with this system value. So you can do things like limit the profile name. Now if you say that, the user profile name cannot be any part of the password. So if my profile name is Carol, I can't make my password name Carol, for example. So Carol cannot be any part of my password. So that, again, just in and of itself, the V6R1 password rules provide a lot of good function. Well, in V7R2, there was a change that came in, and the new value that can be specified for password rules is called all create and change. Now, this one's really interesting. So if we step back and think about how users change their password, end users change their password through the change password command. But it's always been the case that an administrator can change a user's password through the change user profile command. So between the create user profile command and the change user profile command, administrators could always specify anything for that system or for that password, and it did not have to comply with the system values for passwords. It didn't have to follow the rules, for example. Not so much anymore if you specify the all, create, and change. What this is saying is that even if you use create or change user profile, the password specified, even for create and change user profile, must match the rules. Okay? So you might sit there and think, hey, that is great. And to a large extent, it is great. But you have to think through some of your processes before you just automatically add this value. Think about your help desk processes. You may have to do some education for your help desk to have them no longer just give users a simple password when they call in to reset their password. Okay, so that's one thing that you want to think about. The other thing is that maybe your processes for creating a user profile need to change so that they are now creating profiles with a complex password. The other thing is when you go to install a new vendor product. A lot of products, including the SkyView product, create a user profile to own the application. Now in our case, we set the password to *none, so there isn't a password. So anytime you install a SkyView product, you're not going to have to worry about this. But other vendors have profiles that have been left at a default password. That will no longer work. So that user profile creation is actually going to fail. So let me show you what I mean by that. If you are going to have values like this, so I have specified the minimum, in my opinion, of what you want to specify in the password rules system value. So minimum length of 8, which is best practices now, maximum length of 10. Now if you have password level at 2 or 3, you can have a much larger or longer maximum length. But if you're at level 0 and 1, you're stuck with maximum length of 10. So minimum length 8, maximum of 10, require at least 1 digit, limit profile name, that's the key here, and the all, create, and change. So the effect with that is that when I go to create a user profile, if I leave the user password at the default of user profile, I now get a message that says password does not meet all password rules, and the create of the user profile did not work. So let me repeat that. With these values right here, in particular the all, create, and change, and the limit profile name, you will no longer be able to create a user profile with a default password because the password rules were not followed, and it will not allow the creation of the user profile. So that's great. You will never be able to have a profile on your system with a default password again, which I think from a security perspective is awesome. However, again, you need to think through some of your processes, and my guess is that until the vendors see this happen on a few systems, their install process is going to fail. So think about that one before you actually set it. Okay, so last but absolutely and definitely not least is the function that came in V7R2 called row and column access control. So row and column access control is to me the biggie of V7R2. And what this allows you to do is using SQL, you can have an SQL permission that is put in place at the file level that is outside of the program logic that limits which rows users can see. Now, this has the potential of eliminating logical files. So all you system administrators out there are jumping for joy. But before you just automatically go and think you can get rid of those, we need to talk about the implications and how you manage these and that sort of thing. But that's what the row permissions do. At the column level, the row and column access control put in place, again, rules that you can put in place using SQL that allow you to present to the user a masked value rather than the actual value of that field. So pretty cool stuff, but let's look at it a little bit closer. So before you can use this function, you have to have BOSS option 47 installed. It's a no-charge option, but it does not automatically get installed. You have to make sure that it is installed. It's called IBM Advanced Security for I. It is a no-charge feature, so make sure that is installed if you want to use the row and column access control. And to administer these permissions or grant these permissions or put the masks in place, you have to have the security administration function usage, or this Q IBM_DB_SecAdmin privilege. So you can either do this through commands or, again, back in application administration, and that's where I prefer to administer this. So that would look like this. Again, we've opened up app admin, all right, and we have gone to the host application tab. We've opened up IBM I, opened up database, and now there's this database security administrator function. You'll notice that by default, the all object access is not checked. That is very key to this. So when I go to the next screen and say customize, what you would want to do is perhaps give your DB2s, your database administrators, this function, the ability to do database security administration. Now, what does this actually mean? So what this allows you to do, for one thing, you must have this privilege to be able to define through SQL the row and column access control privileges. Okay, so to be able to define that, you must have this privilege, including anybody that has all object, unless you would go in and check this box that says users with all object system privilege. Okay, by default that is not checked. So by default, your all object users cannot add row and column access control privileges. The other thing that this does is not just allow administration of row and column access controls, but it allows the person that has this privilege the ability to grant and revoke authorities to a database file, as well as change the ownership. Now think about that for a moment. If you have somebody that is doing database administration, perhaps your DBAs or your system analysts, that type of thing, typically if they are going to administer privileges, they are going to have all object because you can't grant something you don't have. So you either have to give them all to the file itself or you have to give them all object. Giving them this privilege allows them to administer the privileges and the ownership of those tables without giving them that authority themselves. So this is very powerful. It was done so that you could have more separation of duties. So again, the database security administrator function allows you to define the row and column access privileges, but it also allows those users with that privilege to manage the table's owner as well as grant and revoke the authorities. So again, very powerful stuff. Okay, so let's take a look more closely at the row and column access controls. So if you assign a privilege using SQL to, say, filter out which rows some group of users sees, they first must have authority to the underlying table. So it's not like this privilege usurps the object level security that we know and love. They must first have privilege to the object. So if there is a private authority or public authority of exclude to a table, that user is still not going to be able to access the table at all, regardless of any kind of permissions that have been put on through RCAC. And don't you just love that acronym, RCAC? Ugh, sounds terrible. Anyway, once activated, the row and column access control is just like object level security, which is another reason I love this function, is because just like object level security is in effect regardless of how the file is accessed, same thing with row and column access control. So regardless of whether somebody is coming in through FTP or ODBC or through a web application or through command line access, regardless, this is always in effect. So that's the power of object level security, and that's the power of row and column access control. It is always in effect regardless of the access method. So how do you do this? Well, again, this is SQL, and you will have to go in through the inav run SQL scripts functionality to add these permissions. So this is just an example of adding the permission. Okay, so this would be an example of saying if a user is in the manager 1 group and the department is 001, they would see the rows for 001. If they're in the manager 2 group and their department is 002, those are the rows that they're going to see. Or if they're a director, they would see basically everything. So one of the things that was also added in V7R2 is a new SQL function called verify group for user. So basically, this will allow you to put on permissions based on a user's group and not have to put on permissions individually. That would have been an administrative disaster. So fortunately, they added the new function that allows you to put these permissions on by group. Okay, so that's great. Now, you can add these permissions or you create these permissions, but it's not activated until you actually do the alter table and actually activate the row and column access control. So you can define them, but it won't be active until you actually activate it. Now, I've popped up this other permission that was being granted, and it says current user equals application owner. So a lot of us have started to use adopted authority for access control so that we can put a public authority of use on the tables, public authority of exclude on the tables, and change programs to adopt so the application will still work coming through a menu environment, but it will be prevented from being accessed through something like ODBC. Well, in this case, we still want that adopted authority to work. So there's now this thing called a session user and a current user. The session user is the actual profile trying to access the file itself. Then there's this thing called a current user. Really kind of confusing terminology here, but just remember that the session user is the actual person or the actual program or profile trying to access the file, the table. The current user is the owner of the last program where the program is set to user profile star owner. So in other words, it's the last profile being adopted. So the last owner of the last program that adopts. So you can still use adopted authority to have the users gain access to the files. So that is another powerful thing that they added to this permissions. Now there are some considerations that you want to make, just like there's considerations when you add a logical file to a physical file. There's some administrative considerations that you want to make. This does not come for free. The row and column access controls don't come for free from an administrative point of view. You really want to have to think this thing through and do some significant testing. For one thing, the absence of authority in this case prevents access to data. So in the previous example, we were talking about departments here. So if you add a new department like Department 3, you're going to have to remember to come in here and add a new row permission for Department 3, or else they're not going to see any of their data. So the absence of authority prevents access to data. If you don't have a permission, you're not going to see the data. So you need to think about that. You also need to think about how production issues are being debugged. A lot of you are using some sort of tool or have some sort of method of elevating, for example, a programmer's authority on production when they have to go in and debug a production issue. So when that happens, you may need to think about adding a permission for the profile that's being elevated so that that profile has access to be able to see the data that needs to be debugged. So that's one thing to think about that. The other thing is that there is no indication that the data is subsetted, and that's by design. So that's good and bad. From an end user perspective, there's no need to tell them they're only seeing part of their data. The other thing is that it doesn't provide any bounce back to the application that would cause them to have to see an indication or deal with an indication that it's subsetted data. All of these rules, all these permissions are outside of application logic. The downside to that is that, again, if you're trying to debug a situation, you don't know that you're seeing subsetted data. So again, from a debug perspective, there's going to have to be a learning curve when you're using these permissions. Then when copying files, tables to a QA or development system, you may need to grant additional row privileges for testing. Oftentimes there are different profiles on development and tests than there were on production. So you may need to go back in and either change the permissions to grant those to different users or add additional ones. The other thing is that because this data is now being filtered through the row and column access support, you are going to want to make sure that the filters are working correctly, either through different queries, because query may be bringing back slightly different information, like a work query or a regular query that's been running, because now it's going to be filtered through these permissions, the row permissions. Also, if you are doing any filtering within your application logic itself, you may want to make sure that the filters on top of that logic still produce the right information. Hopefully that does. But there, again, needs to be significant testing put in place to make sure everything is still working as you want it to work. Now, the interesting thing about this, and again, some people, you're not going to care about this because you are an iNav user and it's not a problem, but for those of you who are green screen lovers and only do green screen, this is going to kill you, because the only indication that there is a row and column access restriction on your green screen is if you do a display object authority or edit object authority command, and you will see a new parameter that says row or column access control, and there will be an active or not. So that is the only indication you've got these permissions in place. So from the green screen perspective. So where you have to manage this, again, is through iNav. So this is an example of putting a column mask in place, all right? So I'm creating a column mask, and again, I've come in through Run SQL scripts, and I'm doing create a create mask, in this case on a social security number, okay, and I have committed this, I've activated it. Once I've activated it, there will be an indication. Again, I'll come back to that other slide. I come in through iNav, and so I come under my schemas. We now have a category for column masks and row permissions. When I click on column masks, I see the mask that I just created here. When I click on the actual mask itself, I see this screen, and this is the screen where it actually lists out what the mask is. So again, this is only managed through iSeries Navigator. So you'll have to get used to that. Okay, so when we talk about the column mask, again, this is a great function, but understand it is absolutely not a replacement for encryption. So if you have requirements to encrypt data, you will need to use the FIELDPROC support. But it is a good option, especially on test systems where you don't have a process in place that is already masking the data or somehow obfuscating the data so it's not real data. So this is I think a good replacement for clear text data on test systems. The other thing is that you need to consider the program logic. It's possible that if you are reading a record and you get a masked value back, and then you just blindly rewrite that record, you would actually overlay the production data with the masked value. So you need to carefully think about that, that program logic. Now there has been a new support come in for check constraints that will help prevent this from happening. Basically, you can say, if a field looks like this value, don't write it back. So there is a great article by Kent Milligan from MC Press that talks about protecting against accidental updates that will explain that support that came in. Okay, the other thing is that when restoring a row and column access protected file to another system, whether we're talking about the masks or we're talking about the row permissions, either way, if you restore a file that's been protected with row and column access controls to another system, the data will not be accessible unless that BOSS option is also installed on that other system. So just remember that. So obviously taking a file backwards to a previous release, if you've got row and access control permissions, is not going to work. Those permissions obviously can't go backwards because they're part of V7R2. Okay, so we've been through these slides. So the thing that I want to emphasize is that the row and column access control permissions is very powerful, and it is going to allow you some flexibility that you don't have. However, you really, 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 really want to do your research, and you really want to make sure that you've tested it thoroughly before you actually put it into production. Now, there's a lot of different references out here and resources. There is just a new red paper that has been released that talks about, in great detail, about the row and column access control function. Gives a lot of great considerations before changing, things you'll want to test, things that may work differently once you put the permissions in place. Gives great examples. It's written by a lot of the stars of DB2. So you want to look at that, and that is going to be probably your Bible for row and column access control, this red paper. So good piece of work right there. The details of the audit journal entry that support the row and column access control can be found at the, this is a security reference manual resource, or a link to the security reference manual. Okay, so for other information, I've put a link here to our YouTube channel because, for one thing, that's where all of these recorded Coffee with Carols come in. This is also where you would find the recording for Patrick Townsend's webinar on FIELDPROC support. So I wanted to make sure that you are aware that we had a YouTube channel and that resource is out there for you. Also, there's information in my book. Here's information on the technical updates that came in between V7R1 and V7R2. a link to the Information Center, and I think that that's it for the slideshow. So I thank you for your time this morning and for listening, and I will be turning this back over to JD.
So let me start our bonus session now on our SkyView Managed Security Services. This is something that our clients are have been very excited for us to implement for them, and I'd like to share with you very briefly. We'll just take a few minutes. What we're hearing from our customers, and what I'm assuming a lot of you are in the same situation, is they don't have time for security. Probably more accurately, they don't have enough time for security. And it's not that security isn't important. It certainly is important. But what we're trying to do is to be able to become a valued member of our client's IT team and help them monitor their security and actually do it for them. So the key here is monitoring. I went back real briefly just to look up monitoring, observe and check the process, and keep under systematic review, and I think that's important. Maintain regular surveillance over it. So with Managed Security Service, it's a monthly offering where SkyView security experts, which are led by Carol Woodbury, will pay attention to your IBM I security so that you don't have to. This service is also available for AIX and Linux as well. What happens with the Managed Security Service is there are two components to this. One is a monthly reporting. SkyView will work with you to set up reports that are sent to SkyView on 10 key security attributes or audit events. We'll monitor those for you and we'll send a report back to you. There's also an annual component where we will perform a risk assessment, a comprehensive review, and the client and SkyView will work together on when that's done during the year of the Managed Security Service term. So then what happens is SkyView delivers a summary report, an actual Word document, and I'm going to show you an example of that in just a second so that you can have that defined process in place. This is generally a huge process, a huge plus for your auditors. What areas can be covered? Again, this is something that's very client-specific. We found a few areas that kind of overlap most of our clients. For example, identifying profiles with new special authorities is almost always on the list, as well as default passwords, changes to system values, programs that adopt invalid sign-on attempts, just to give you a few examples. But again, we work with you on the kinds of things that you want to have SkyView review for you. So again, SkyView sets up the reports to run on your system using SkyView provided tools. You don't have to buy any additional tools. We have those reports emailed to SkyView. On a monthly basis, we'll generate a report that begins looking like this. This is just the beginning of it. But if you had SkyView reviewing the new profiles or profiles that gained all object authority, this would be the four-liner in this case that you would get. You would see these two profiles have gained all object authority. So it couldn't be simpler for you to review this as something that, is this something that needs your attention or not? Also, I mentioned that we'll get an annual security review, so you'll get the output from our risk assessor software, the main assessment guide, which will go over areas and compare over 100 areas to best practices. So this is an annual diagnostic tool that we'll run with you, and we will review with you as well. Administrators are using Managed Security Services to ensure that security is monitored at least monthly. Purely the definition of monitoring, as we showed earlier. You have those experts' second pair of eyes to help you identify unusual behavior. It's used to meet audit and compliance requirements, consolidate reports from multiple locations or multiple systems. This is a way to really limit the time and resource necessary to do that review by having SkyView do it for you and provide the summary reports. So our customers are saying things like, couldn't be happier. This one particular customer was the only admin at this location, admittedly not a security expert, and to have the security monitored monthly by SkyView was well worth it to him. We'd love to see the second one, as I'm sure you'll love to see it once you talk more with us about it. Pricing was such that it's a no-brainer. And finally, with managed security service, just one less thing to actively have to manage. So kind of saying the same thing, but it's going over and over again. If you don't have time or enough time for security, we'd love to talk with you more. Our people here at SkyView, contact SkyViewPartners.com, contact your authorized SkyView reseller. We'll be happy to review this with you.